Now, why is that big data is so much of a buzzword? Why is it so important? Why has it suddenly become so prominent? These are the reasons which we should actually look into one by one. 90% of this data, what we're talking about, the big data, has been generated in the last 2 to 3 years. If you ask the question like, wasn't there so much of data before then? Exactly, it was not so much of data, especially the unstructured data, which is contributing to the bulk of big data. Like 80 to 90% of the big data is going to be unstructured data. So less than 20% of the data is going to be structured. This unstructured data combined with the total big data, everything has been generated in just less than 2 to 3 years. The problem with this data is that they are unstructured, so they cannot actually be fit into the traditional RDBMS based systems. So structured database management systems or the SQL based systems, they cannot handle this kind of data. But the data what we are getting is in large numbers, dominantly unstructured. But why is this data so interesting is because we have the technologies now in form of Hadoop and other related technologies to mine this data, trying to see if we can make some business sense out of this data. And what is the value of this analysis? That is something which is very important for the business users. For the business perspective, it can be of tremendous potential. And most of this information actually is sitting idle in the dormant data, which actually is being archived for all these years. So the companies are trying to invest in trying to dig into this data, trying to analyze the data, mine the data to figure out, is there any business usefulness? Can they make some impactful decisions based on the analysis what they do on this data? The advantage with this big data technology is prevalent these days is that in a very cost-effective manner, you can actually mine this data. Traditionally, it was a very expensive affair if you have to mine large amounts of data through the traditional data warehousing techniques. But now that's not the case. It's more efficient and it's more economical and more quicker as well. That's the reason why big data has been so prominent. The characteristics of big data is usually discussed in terms of the V's. So when it started, it was actually 3 V's or 4 V's, and now we actually have 6 V's, where each V actually stands for the following terms. Volume, like the volume represents the sheer bulk of the data which is being generated, which we have already covered in the previous slides. Velocity represents the rate at which, or the speed at which the data is being generated. We just had a glimpse of, say, a few terabytes or 5 to 10 terabytes of data is uploaded into YouTube every single minute. That's an example of the velocity or the rate at which data is getting generated and ingested into some servers where it is getting stored. Variety. So like 80 to 90% of the big data is going to be semi-structured or unstructured, and there's a huge variety in this. If you just take a quick look, we have text data, photo images, voice data, video data, geospatial data. We have lots of data, sensor data. Veracity, this is closely associated with variety. We have veracity mainly because of variety. So veracity mainly deals with the uncertainty or the correctness of the data, or data ambiguity, you can say. It's not about data integrity, it's about the ambiguity in the data. For example, you're collecting some data from a sensor. So that sensor data is used to capture the temperature readings for that day on every minute, on a minute-to-minute basis. Now, how sure can you be that the data which is generated by the sensor is accurate to what percentage? That's the reason why 1 in 3 business leaders do not completely trust the information what they actually try to get and based on which they try to make decisions. They do not completely trust this information because there's always some percentage of error which could creep into the systems which is trying to generate and save data. This actually is what veracity speaks about. Then the 2 new V's which actually was compelled or which probably got crept into this the characteristics of big data more recently is one is the veracity, other one is the variability. The variability actually speaks about the inconsistencies in the rate at which data is generated. Meaning, there could be like 1,000,000 tweets on some hot trending topic for that particular day, or there could be like just a few 100,000 tweets on a normal day. So you cannot rely that the same data source is going to produce the data at the same volume at every given point of time. There's going to be a variation because these sources are going to capture data from dynamic events which happen in real life. The last and the most important V is the value. What is the reason why we try to mine and dig into all this data, and what is the reason why we want to perform some kind of analysis activity on this data? At the end of the day, we have to figure out like what is the value proposition what you get out of mining this data. What is the business value, what it actually makes at the end of the day is very important. This slide actually would give you an overview of the major industries or the major verticals which actually is trying to use big data, the potential consumers of the big data, and what they want to make out of it. It's up to their individual business use cases. We have the financial services, the healthcare, and retail. These are the three major industries which work a lot on big data because the decisions what they need to take are directly related to the big data analysis results. Financial services, they need big data analytics mainly for fraud detection, and most recently within the financial services, personalized banking services are gaining momentum in terms of big data analytics. The healthcare, yes, previously the big data research task was pretty much restricted to the major players in healthcare because it was an expensive affair in terms of procuring the tools as well as the technologies available for mining the big data in the healthcare domain. But now, since the advent of big data, the technology is not actually very expensive. So many players in the healthcare segment actually will start working on big data related projects, and it can be a pretty vibrant market out there. Retail industry has been one of the oldest consumers of big data, but in different ways. They were the ones who were actually using data warehousing techniques very heavily, and now it's slowly going to be big data technologies which is going to replace or the major components of the data warehousing techniques and methodologies. And the most recent actually has been the web and social media analytics companies who are heavily looking into big data related research works for behavioral and social analytics. Apart from which, we do have the manufacturing industries and the government-based institutions and organizations which are actually working on big data related projects. Government industries basically for reducing fraud. For example, you can think of the Aadhaar card, why actually it is going to be in place, or you can think about the social security thing in the US. It's pretty common, like they want to keep tab of all your possible information and all the data what is collected from your major events in your life, basically for reducing fraud and for research studies on segmented populations and customized action that needs to be taken on that particular population. Now, in the next slide, this will actually give you a picture of various use cases of big data. There is actually a bar graph representation on which is segmented as per the industries. Here, the security and investment services and the banking are the two major users of big data technologies, as well as they are the consumers of big data as well. Then comes the social media, communications, utilities, government, manufacturing, transportation, retail. If you have a closer look into this graph, almost every industry are somewhat using big data. The last and the most interesting here would be the consumer and recreation services. This is quite interesting, and I would actually expect this bar to actually grow bigger and bigger in terms of like consumer and recreation services. It's a huge untapped market. Professional services and construction industries for big data, I don't see a lot of growth in this area, but healthcare are going to foresee a huge growth in terms of the users of big data, and the potential outcomes also could be pretty interesting. Having understood what exactly is big data and what are the sources of big data and why has big data become a buzzword now, what exactly are the challenges of big data? When we speak about the challenges of big data, there are two parts to it. The first part being, how are we going to store this data effectively? When it comes to storage, it's not just about storage. How are we going to scale up this storage methodology? Now, the second most important thing about big data is that, assuming that the storage is taken care, a scalable and a cost-effective storage method is taken care by Hadoop, how are we actually going to process this data? End of the day, when it comes to analyzing the data, we need to actually drill down into the bits and pieces or every byte of the data to try to see if it is making some business value. Do we have a cost-effective method to do this? Yes, Hadoop actually comes to the rescue even in that case. So it doesn't mean that if your data volume is going to exponentially rise, the computation time to analyze the data is also going to exponentially rise. No, that's not a feasible approach. We need to have a decent turnaround time, meaning you issue a query, you need to actually have a decent turnaround time in terms of response. So Hadoop actually addresses all these problems that the traditional RDBMS based systems were not able to handle any of these challenges. Summarizing everything what we have covered until now, we had an understanding of what is big data, what are the sources of big data. We tried to understand the amount of data which actually is generated and processed by taking Facebook as an example, and the 6 V's of big data and the challenges associated with the big data. And in the upcoming sessions, we are going to understand how these challenges are actually going to be addressed by a technology framework called Hadoop. Thank you.